Hey guys, hope you're enjoying my series so far on the year flashbacks, looking at some of the titles that are kind of leading edge of jazz in that year. Just giving you an idea what would have been in a great record store. And now I want to do something here a little bit to set the table. I want to talk about what would be for sale in a not great record store. Just to kind of set the record straight for people, because that was the whole point of that premise for my episode on this series, is that this is a great record store. New York, Chicago, LA. They got some guy who's bringing records in from all over the country who knows the jazz scene. That was not the norm. Most small labels don't exist outside of their regional markets. Bringing them across the country would have been done in the smallest of numbers for a few important retailers who probably had a guy that did that for them. You know, almost hand delivered product from Chicago and New York to LA stores. But that was not the norm for these small labels. They weren't distributing nationwide. And so we've talked about what a good record store might have looked like with all those great artists on the wall. I want to now kind of set the picture and give people a concept of what an average record store looked like in 96% of the country, coast to coast. And this same is going to hold true for the England on some level. We were talking in the comments with a couple of folks about what an English store would look like. We talked, a couple of guys, we talked about the 78s. And the 78s were definitely still available into the 50s, you know, and you could probably even find them in some record stores into the early 60s, I have to guess, because that amount of shellac that was printed, it was just out there, had to be sold somewhere. So they probably just marked it down, and they slowly moved through it. But the 10-inch LP did come around in 1950, and the major labels all went through it. The small labels adopted it, and then the major labels extended to the 12-inch. By 53, 54, you see them big labels switching over to the 12-inch LP. It takes the small labels another 18 months to kind of be able to do it financially, changing over inventory, stock, selling product. But there were definitely 78 still in stores in the mid to late 50s. You know, and I'm guessing that section got smaller and more pushed back into a corner as the decade wore on. The 45s that were coming to the fore, you know, as a way to sell singles. And the LP, because these big labels were so powerful, there's no way they didn't introduce those things in pretty big numbers into the marketplace, coast to coast. And like a new game system, it just had to be even when CDs were introduced, that I do remember well, they forced those into record stores, relegated vinyl and cassette departments, and started printing all the inventory from the cassette and vinyl era onto CD. And you kind of you felt obligated to start buying the compact disc. You just kind of did. And they got big chunks of the store pretty much off the bat. So musically, I want to talk musically though. What was available in the country in a small regional store? And I'm not talking bumfuck towns. I'm talking your Boise, Idahos, your Fargo, North Dakotas, Madison, Wisconsin, Springfield, Illinois, Jackson, Mississippi, Tallahassee, Florida. Your mid to big size cities, none of your huge central Miami's, Atlanta. We're not talking those places. We're going to talk mid-sized American cities down to small. When you walked into a record store, it might just be even a section at Woolworths or Kmart. What was the common fare? And something like Rosemary Clooney, for a lot of Americans, she was cheeky and a little bit risque. She was using that Negro colored music, and it's a little seductive for our liking, you know. And that being said, pop and jazz had become very synonymous, and a lot of the things that we remember, like Glenn Miller, is the best of the worst, or the worst of the best, however you want to look at it. Glenn could play. You know, it's a kind of a clean, white, safe swing. But this was dancing, sensual, popular, because jazz had become the pop music so dominating in such a way that pop and jazz were very hard to extricate. And when we think of jazz and our perceptions of jazz, almost all of what we think of as the greats are non-existent in most of the country. I'm going to show you some stuff from the 10-inch era. That'll give you an idea of what most people in Wichita, Tulsa, Topeka, Helena, Flagstaff, Bakersfield, you name it. This would have been the good jazz that was available. Oh, cool. Modern, cool, hip. I like it. And then I'm going to give you some stuff I'm going to show you that they never would have seen. So, this for the most part was the pop music, but still jazzy to most people, versus the classical, versus the kind of more rigid, folky tradition of white Eurasian experience. This still borrows from that Negro kind of swing, groove, accent, and it still would have had certain elements being in disapproval of this, believe it or not. So that was going to be in the jazz section, pop, but we know that's got Negro connotations, and people were shy of it. Perceptions, you know. Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, two of the great Jewish players of this music of that time, were a great bridge between the white and the black music. They understood oppression and they understood the music and do a wonderful job bringing this music to white people in a safe context. This is fantastic. This is the great Begin the Begin with the Artie Shaw Orchestra. And these songs, there was no internet, you know what I mean? These songs lived for a long time. There was no chat rooms. There was no, it was just a much smaller world. And so songs like this took a long time to even cross the country. And once they did, they became standards for a decade. And so this song sold forever. You know, Greg Goodman tracks sold forever. The Dorsey brothers, those guys sold forever. But let's remember, Shaw, Goodman, Dorsey, this is not lame stuff. This was the best of the best. Like, this was for the mass consumer. There's a lot of really bad jazz, really not swinging, really not understanding what it was about, that was being consumed and bought and played all across the country. And we remember the Goodmans and we remember the Artie Shaws and those guys because they were actually really good at it. They really were. They really played that black music well. And for most of the country, that's what you were going to get. The cool stuff was going to be the white cats who could really play like black guys. And black, it was known this was black music, and it was definitely no secret where it came from, but the connection that white America had to black America was not there. You didn't have access to what was happening in the black community. And so really, your knowledge of black music was going to be more through rumor and myth and hearing white musicians talk about it and tell you, oh, I played with Basie's guys backstage in Kansas City last month. Those guys were awesome. And they were friends backstage. They played after hours. But the average white American kid who heard this music and wanted it, access to the black music of myth was hard to get. You started having access to stuff like Ellington. Nat Cole was something that comes along that's going to be in stores. Stuff from musicals with Patti Page, Vic Damone, Rusty Draper, and a Sarah Vaughan song stuck in there, the fantastic Whatever Lola Wants. A little more Sarah Vaughan comes a little later. Sophie Tucker, Benny Goodman. This is what was going to be available and would have been seen as mostly good stuff. That was the good stuff. Stuff that we kind of turn our noses up at now. Now we're going to move into the 10-inch era. And if you want to have an idea, this young guy from the Tommy Dorsey group, I need to get some of his stuff. Right? This was what a lot of jazz cats in the middle of the country would have known as the language. And Sinatra has quite a bit of stuff coming out. He's under contract with Columbia at this point, before his Capitol years. And some of the stuff is actually really great. You know, it's really amazing stuff. And even like today, it's capturing that black feeling. That's what it's about. That's where the allure comes from. Peggy Lee was something of a phenomenon in the 40s, 50s, Decca RCA. She makes great records into the 50s, into the 60s, really. Very much, I have a huge collection of her 12-inch LPs. She's very much a crossover star between pop and elements of jazz. But for a lot of people in America, Peggy Lee would have been jazz. And her version of Black Coffee on here is fantastic. And you remember, it's these big labels like Decca, like Columbia, that had the power to push product into every 5 and dime store across the country. And there's some great jazz right there. You know, but so much of the canon, as we define it today, the things that we think jazz sound like, most of that comes at the very tail end of the donkey. But B, even the stuff that we think of as the center early figures, the Hawkins, the Ben Websters, the Parkers, the Gillespies, this stuff was so peripheral to white America. Fantastic version of Black Coffee. Mel Torme. Mel Torme is a fantastic guy who sings with a lot of real genuine jazz sensibility in his voice. He's a risque, kind of cheeky, double entendres, but with a passionate and a sincerity that would have caught on with American youth. And that groove in the back there, that bass and that little, it's the sensuality of jazz. And for most Americans, I can bring this home to mom, and she's still gonna be like, "Really, son?" You know, it's the spacing of it, the rocking motion of it. It's enticing, and it's Woody Herman, Stan Kenton. We talked a lot about these guys on the jazz series. These guys in an average American record store in 1953-54 would have been some cutting edge stuff. Ooh, look what I just found today. I found the new Woody Herman at Carnegie Hall from 1946 with Flip Phillips, Chubby Jackson, Red Norval, Bill Harris, Pete Condoli. Oh my gosh. Oh my God, I found the Stan Kenton in this modern world. Like, this would have been what you scored. You'd have heard of it. The radio stations would have, kids would have been talking about it. And they probably have a knowledge of maybe a Coleman Hawkins and saying, boy, that so-and-so Mariano sure plays like a brother. But this was some of the edges of the sound. Cool, spacey, modern, conducted. Not a lot of blackness in that, though. Shorty Rogers was a guy that was a fantastic fiery player, and they gave him a record. So what I'm trying to drive home here is that the real seeds and nucleus of the music, it's so not known. The music that we think of today as jazz from these eras, in that moment, was so on the periphery. A record label like Capitol was putting out this series of jazz, and this would have been available coast to coast, and you'd have seen these and be like, oh crap, the new Boots from Seeley record. Oh shoot, Salvador, he plays with Kenton. Oh, Frank Rosalino, that guy's amazing. Claude Williamson, that guy can sure play piano. Bob Cooper, one of my favorite sax players. This was jazz. That was the modern small group. These guys had heard bebop, of course. The players had heard bebop, but this stuff here was very much the risky white players of the day. Capitol might put a little compilation like this out and put some riskier Tristano and even a black guy, Miles Davis, is snuck in there. No photographs, of course, but boy, that Miles Davis. I don't think Mom will even know that's a black guy. It's sad that race is such a part of this, but it's just such a part of this. You know, it would be foolish to think that the icons, the greats, would be something that would be available to everybody. Some of the modern jazz that would have been available. And I'm going to show you a little stack here, some cool 10 inches. And I want to preface this by saying that I would have to guess, if you was in a record store in Topeka, Kansas, 1953, some of the stuff would have made it there. And it would have made it there in small numbers. And I'd go so far as to say that you might have a section like this. The rest would be the Rosemary Clooneys, the Sinatras, the Dorseys, just endless white, milky interpretations of jazz. And then this would be a little section of modern stuff on small labels that no one even knew. On Roost, some Johnny Smith guy. I heard he's a great player. This Dave Brubeck guy, he's kind of hip. He's kind of modern. Oh, another Brubeck record, cool. Lee Konitz. He looks pretty dated. Look at him. The black. Oh, I gotta check that out. To a young white kid, look at this, Cal Jader. That's kind of neat. This was not commonplace stuff, though. Jerry Mulligan. He looks like he's playing like a black guy. Like it's such an enticing a mixed cover. 54, this comes out with Chico on the cover. And I remember a label like Pacific would have had a far better distribution than a Blue Note. But still, these Pacific and Fantasy records would have had pretty small distributions compared to Capitol, Decca, Columbia, RCA. Norman Granz on the Clef Mercury. He licensed some stuff to Mercury at the time because Mercury had a lot of pressing plants. That you might have found that and been like, oh, sweet. Howard Rumsey, I've heard of him. He's cool. Who's it? Stan Levy, Bob Cooper, Claude Williamson, Stu Williamson. Those guys all played with Stan Kenton. Oh my gosh. Gotta get that. Red Norvo, I heard he's pretty cool. Like, this would have been the risky. Charlie Ventura. Stan Getz. I like Stan Getz, I think I heard about him one time. I heard he plays like that Charlie Parker guy. But Parker wasn't known. You had to be a kid that knew a kid who knew a kid who once went to Chicago and heard about Charlie Parker. See what I'm saying? And the closest you could get to Charlie Parker, if he was in Prairie Fields, Kansas, was maybe driving to Wichita. Oh, Stan Getz. I read one time in Downbeat that Getz plays like Parker. I gotta buy that. I got some great Roos Stan Getz stuff here. It's great stuff. But even these Roos would have sold very minimally. But this was some modern small label white jazz that would have been far more accessible and easy to find than small label black jazz, which would have been nearly impossible to get in most parts of the country. And that's what makes it so interesting to see how history has made us think that things look different than, like, these guys were big stars. They weren't. Most of the white cats were the big stars. Armstrong, Ellington, Basie. That was kind of the end of, you could get Savoy, maybe Marion McPartland, that British gal doing some piano jazz. I found that. It was at the Kmart today. $2. I bought it. She can really play. Like, that's kind of what Billy and Jimmy were going to have access to finding. You know, it was slim pickings. And you knew the music was black. And you'd heard whispers from the cool kids and the bad kids. But you didn't really know. So again, this was what most people would have had access to around the country. The stuff I'm showing you in these great record stores, you'd have had to go to Chicago to get that. If you were in a place, Annapolis, Maryland, you know what I mean, just all these mid-sized cities, if you had a chance to find a Riverside or a Blue Note, it was going to be something like this. You might find a Sidney Bechet, you know, his Dixieland, old school eras concerts from France. You know, you might find those, and that would have been like, ooh, cool. And that, his revival kind of instills this entire revival in the Dixieland movement. And even to most of white America, Dixieland was still that kind of edgy black music from the South. You know, so George Lewis had a bit of a revival. Riverside was really kind of unknown, but Lou Waters, great West Coast Dixie, Art Hodes, Chicago Dixieland stuff, New Orleans Horns, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, and Freddie Keppard. You know, this, you'd have had access to some of these. Some record store in the Midwest would have imported a few of these from out east. Jimmy Blythe, I heard he's cool. Like, it's stuff we kind of had, the Dorseys, stuff that we kind of haven't really followed today. Red Nichols and Miff Mole, you know, great Dixieland stuff. Johnny Dodds, an actual brother right there, with only a pencil drawing, of course. And then Bob Helms, clarinet, Dixieland stuff. So, like, there was a reason why Blue Note and Riverside were doing those series. There was a chance they would get those imported. Now, again, that was still, for the most part, old school stuff. A lot of it was white guys. Bechet was a Creole. Jelly Roll Morton was a light-skinned Creole brother. And you would see his stuff. It's on London. Decca's affiliate. You know, they put, I believe it's, I might have misspoke there. I don't have a lot of London knowledge, to be honest. But, so labels like Brunswick would put out a King Oliver, Louis Armstrong would be on Decca. These would be black records that you'd have a chance to find, especially on Decca. Brunswick's a little more regional. Decca, you could find Decca across the country. So this is like a black record you could find. And I think it's important to grasp this, just so we put a lot of this black music in its proper place. And how, in retrospect, how much it's grown in value. Now there's some swing. Count Basie on the Clef label, little 10-inch. It feels different right from the opening stanza. You're like, ooh, something like this? You had a tough time finding this on Clef Records outside of the big cities. You might. Another Basie on Columbia. Again, what's missing from the piano there? You got a stool, you got the piano, it's rocking and shaking, but you know what's not there? The brother who played it. If you knew that was a bad brother supposed to be sitting there, but that piano ain't rocking and shaking for no reason. It's because that music shakes like no other thing they ever heard. But you gotta be careful, because race, because of the ignorance. Ellington had some pretty good pull. He'd been playing and touring the country, doing state fairs, playing all kinds of just whatever work you could find for decades. And so even white America was fairly comfortable with the Count. But it sure didn't stop them from putting a little white guy on the cover, House Party Series. You know, house party music, Columbia. And again, if you're in most of the country, oh my God, there's an Ellington 10-inch here on Columbia. I'm gonna grab this, $3. You'd have been ecstatic, you know, ecstatic to find that. In a more serious vein, Columbia does issue the Liberian Suite, and it's a master work. This is some stuff on Capitol, Duke Ellington and his orchestra. Here's some stuff on a small little label called Jazz Panorama. Outstanding stuff. Let's play a little bit of that. But listen to the swing, the repetition, the groove. This is some Jazz Panorama, Duke Ellington, Volume 1. You might have found a Sarah Vaughan. She'd had some success singing Broadway stuff, made it into a few film scores, soundtracks. She had some chance of being available on Columbia. This might have made it into Middle America, but I'm guessing a lot of stores wouldn't have stocked that. Teddy Wilson, Benny Goodman brought him to the foreground. They're going to put out a little 10-inch of him here on MGM. Again, what is missing from this picture? Ain't no brother to be seen. This is how you got black music. You found it in almost an anonymous sense. You heard who he was. You knew. Oscar Peterson, you might get this, maybe. Again, what's missing? Ain't no photographs. Emersy was a little bit more ballsy. Here's some Lionel Hampton stuff. But again, Hampton is famous from Goodman, and that would have been a score. If he's coming home from Bismarck, North Dakota, like, oh my God, I found a Lionel Hampton record today. Errol Garner had also some serious inroads into Mid-America. He does a lot of stuff on Columbia, which really helped his career. These Savoy 10-inches wouldn't have been everywhere, but you would have had a chance to find them somewhere. Billy Taylor, now that would have been a modern jazz record that you'd have been like, oh, I scored. Illinois Jack Cat, there's a chance a brother like that might have gotten into a Middle America record store. And then if you had a really, really good day, and you in Aurora, Colorado, Tucson, Arizona, you know what I mean? You in Eugene, Oregon, using any kind of place in Ohio, and you an hour and a half away from Cleveland. Detroit's 3 hours, Pittsburgh's 4. And I went to my local Kmart today, and they had Coleman Hawkins. That was what? Woo! Roy Eldridge. I found a Roy Eldridge on, and again, these are both Emerson. Emerson was a little bit more willing. Mercury, seemed to have a little bit more of a level head, but even these don't have brothers on the cover. This is what you might find. And Emerson had a decent distribution pretty quickly because Mercury grew pretty fast. Verve would have had some through Mercury Clef arrangement. Now let me show you stuff you are not going to see. You are not going to see in Pullman, Tennessee, our Blakey records. You aren't going to see those. You aren't going to find Miles Davis. This is back in his Blue Note days, early press. You aren't going to find that in Middle America. You aren't going to find no Fats Navarro, as much as you want to. You got to go to Chicago for that. Gil Mel? Who in Kansas knew about Gil Mel? My guessing is the rumors spread about the black musicians. A guy like Gil Mel sold to art students in the inner cities and college scenes. Maybe. But Blue Note, again, good Blue Notes sold 5,000 copies. Versus a Woody Herman on Capitol Columbia, which would have sold 100,000, 300,000. Goodman records sold hundreds of thousands. These records sold minimal. And that makes them even that much less likely to get distribution into the Midwest, into the South. Herbie Nichols? Nope. Elmo Hope? Not a chance. Would you find Dizzy Gillespie records in the middle of the country? On Blue Note? On Roost? Nope. You're not seeing none of that. A few more things here you'd have never seen. You would never see Sonny Stitt on Roost. You'd never see Sonny Stitt on Roost. Those would not be available to you if you lived in Plainview, Texas. You weren't gonna find that. You weren't gonna find no Don Bias on Savoy. You weren't gonna find no Fats Navarro on Savoy. You weren't gonna find no Kenny Clark on Savoy. And I'm gonna go so far as to say that the really great jazz on Bethlehem, and I love my Bethlehem 10-inchers, I have 37 of them, the whole set. That stuff wasn't going to be available either, even though it was mostly white cats. Their distribution just wasn't there. It probably got pushed into some smaller college towns. So I just wanted to kind of get people to understand that the Rosemary Clooneys, the Peggy Lees, the Patty Pages, the even earlier era singers would have been dominating what record stores had. And some of it would have been more gospel, contemporary, flavored, hymnals even, singing hymns and Christmas songs. The Rosemary Clooneys, Peggy Lees, those were the risque white artists that kind of got lumped in as jazz. But the black artists, especially by the 50s, is so marginalized in a record store setting. And there was breakthroughs. Miles signing with Columbia, he sold 50 to 100,000 copies of most of his late 50s, early 60s titles. Those were anomalies. Brubeck, of course, sold well at Columbia, but the music that we love of and think of as the body of jazz, the canon of jazz, the Blue Notes, Prestiges, the Riversides, what was available by those record labels was the Dixieland stuff that was often by white guys playing the hell out of Dixie, but where even those were kind of unknown, and that would have been a cool find in a lot of small towns. A Sinatra record would have been a cool find, and Sinatra was definitely out there. The Basie, Lionel Hampton, that would have been oh. But I bet you they stocked pretty limited supplies of black music, a lot of towns. And I'm guessing some record stores didn't sell any black records. Race records were sold in racial stores. They had their own stores. And certainly there was great record store owners. Record store people tend to be more liberal, socially conscious people, generally speaking, from musical backgrounds. And so most record store owners, I think, would have made a point, even in mid-sized towns, there was probably one store that was like, oh, if you want that, you should probably go there. Go to Tony's. Tony will probably order that for you, even if he doesn't have it. That new Dexter Gordon record on Bethlehem, oh, Tony might have that. And you might go in there and be like, oh shit, he got my record for me. But you probably had a special order a lot. And I don't even know how available that stuff was a special order. I don't, you know. But when you look at the volume of stuff filling landfills today and basements, and when you look at what makes up most stacks of records that are given to you, you know, when someone gives you a pallet of records, most of it's crap. Most of it's crap that makes the kind of milky white jazz that people shun today sound really badass. You know, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get across to people, is just how sacred and minimal and how fortunate we are to have as much of this black music survive as has. You know, there's such an amazing volume of it available today. A lot of it's in print again, which is exciting. But I think it's just really crazy how we perceive things were versus how things really were. And what we think of as the giants of jazz in these years, this stuff was really underground. You know, it was really underground. And to give an example, a cross-reference, it'd be like talking about the great MCs of 1989. You know, the Rockems, the Chuck D's, you know, KRS-Ones. Those guys were really spilling knowledge, poor righteous teachers. And then trying to recognize that compared to the Bobby Browns, these guys were selling pennies on the dollar. Compared to the big Whitney Houston records, Lionel Richie, Dancing on the Ceiling. Like, and that's not even talking about the pop, Madonna, black ripoff music. You know, Madonna's selling 10 million copies of her record, and Whitney Houston's selling 4 million copies of her record, both to white audiences. A guy like Rakim was probably selling 50, 80,000, 100 copies of their early works. You know, so it's the same kind of thing where we look back and think about all these guys were the giants of hip hop. Run DMC was the first guy that really started selling, first group that really started selling hip hop in any significant numbers because of the Aerosmith crossover. Before that, hip hop was selling real minimal regional numbers on regional labels, which is how almost every new thing comes about. But again, the black jazz music of this era that we so cherish today, we've kind of gotten to a point where we've refined and chiseled the diamond so perfectly and polished it into these 120 facets that we've lost sight of how big a rock this thing came out of. That little diamond of 120 facets of the great jazz players of these eras that we know today and think of as the body of the music was actually this little gem within a voluminous chunk of rock. And most of it's been chiseled, hacked, and forgotten, and become obscure, thankfully, and is filling landfills today. And even the stuff that we don't think of as very good jazz, the Glenn Millers, the Artie Shaws, it's actually really good. Benny Goodman's really good. Even Paul Whiteman's groups could kind of swing. Like, that's the stuff we remember. The Kenting groups, the Woody Herman, those guys could actually play. And that's what we think of as the not so good, but actually that is really good jazz. You know? And it's kind of being obscured as we speak. More and more people are forgetting the Shorty Rogers and the great white players of these eras, as my different series on the saxophones kind of illustrates. But it's great that we look at that diamond and go, wow, is it ever brilliant and amazing? But we should try to keep in mind that it is just a small nucleus of a huge body of music that made up the 20th century's music mid-century, and this small little channel of incredible talent and grit and soul. And turns out it's the guys with the most grit and soul whose music has stood the test of time and become cherished. So I just want to kind of give a bit of insight. Again, we're kind of collecting the cream of the crop. and that's leaving most of it aside in the waste piles, where it belongs. But let's not think that in any kind of sense that the Dexter Gordons, Miles Davis, John Coltrane's, Charlie Parker's were the dominant force in the music industry. They were very much obscure, very obscure. So anyway, y'all be safe. We'll jump into 1957 in the next episode. Y'all be safe. Peace.